Hey, everybody, welcome to Full Stack Chat. This is a podcast where I invite on builders from around the developer community to chat through the products they're building and give advice to potential builders, or representatives from dev tool companies to come on and talk about their product and how they are making the process of building things for builders easier. My name is Brian Morrison. I am a senior developer educator at Clerk, which is a user management platform that is designed to help get authentication added into your applications as quickly and seamlessly as possible. I'm excited today to have Philip Keily today from Baseten, which I bet Philip's going to fill in some of the details here, but Baseten pitches itself as an AI infrastructure platform. So with that, Philip, I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic to you and let you give the audience an introduction about yourself, and then kind of give a brief intro to Baseten and what they do to help builders.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, Brian. I'm Philip. I'm calling in from Redwood City today. You know, climate best by government test, as it says on the sign. And I am a developer advocate for Baseten. Baseten, as you said, is an AI infrastructure platform. And what's cool about what we do is we're 100% focused on inference, which is the process of taking a model and running it in production so that you can actually, get generations out of your model. So it's a really interesting problem. It's something that every single AI product is running into issues with as they scale in production. And it's a just super cool space to work on from a technical perspective and from a business perspective.
It's exciting. I'm looking forward to hearing more about this. Now, before we actually get into the meat of the podcast, which is really going to be about Baseten, I like to kick these off with a little icebreaker, just so the audience and both get myself as well get a chance to know you a little bit better. So the question that I pick for you, which, for people out there, if this is the first time watching or listening to this episode, I do not prep Philip on this, so it's completely off the cuff.
Oh no.
What is I don't pick hard ones. What's the best book or article that you've read recently that helped you learn something, and what was that thing that you learned?
Oh, that's a great question. So I've been taking the Caltrain up to work, which means I've really been on a fiction kick recently, reading a bunch of the new Sanderson books. So I've learned a lot about really cool magic systems that don't exist in the real world. If we're thinking about if we're thinking about a more nonfiction type of thing, I'm a big football fan, and I recently read a really deep dive article on the Eagles' offensive line, and how they are bigger, stronger, tougher, meaner than every other offensive line in the game, and really powered that Super Bowl victory. And when I was reading that article, it made me think a lot about how in a company, everyone has to play a different role, and sometimes there's people who have to play really tough jobs that don't always get recognition. So the thing I really took away from that was thinking about the company I work at, the different roles that people have, and making sure I'm showing appreciation to the people who are in the trenches blocking for me when I'm out there running plays.
That's very interesting. As somebody who's not a sports ball fan, I think I understand a lot of that, and it kind of makes sense that you do have others who are, I don't know, contributing, I guess, to the bigger play, if that makes sense. I think I understood that right.
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. But with that, let's go to Baseten. So you mentioned a little bit earlier in the introduction that it is about model inference, which is
Yes.
a problem that is required in production. Now, as fascinated as I am with AI, I am still very much a noob when it comes to AI. I understand enough to kind of utilize it a little bit for my day job, but the inner workings of AI is something I'm still trying to wrap my head around. In fact, for those of you watching, I guess I don't have the book here. I'm reading a book about AI and LLMs and how to create the necessary workflows and pipelines to get models trained and stuff. But can you fill in some of the gaps there, and I guess talk a little bit more about how Baseten helps this process, and for actual full stack developers who are building products with AI, how does it help them?
Absolutely. So, the very first time I built an AI product, it was a upgrade to this project that I built in college. I built this rules-based poetry generator for a Shakespeare class that I was in, that basically took lines of poetry from William Shakespeare, all of his sonnets, and cut them up and rearranged them into new sonnets that were syntactically correct based on the rules of what a sonnet is. And then when the GPT 3.5 API came out a couple years ago, I was able to take that, and instead of rearranging sonnets, I was able to have it generate entire new ones from scratch that more or less fit those rules. And so in terms of the application I was building, very, very simple, just like a front end with an API call. The API call I was making was to this model. So I would say, hey, write me a sonnet about trees, and it would give me back 14 lines of poetry. The question is, like, what happens in between sending that call and receiving that response? And if you are just building, like I was, a fun little tool for your personal website, it doesn't really matter. Like, you just make the API call, you get the response back, probably. It works most of the time. You pay a couple cents per million tokens, and you just move on with your life. But if you're building an AI native application that's going to be a business where the actual running of the model is, number one, like a major cost for your business, one of the biggest line items in your hosting bill, and number two, absolutely mission critical for your business to run. Like, if your model goes down, or if your model's slow, if your model outputs are bad, then your business stops working, you stop making money, your customers can't use your application. Well, in that case, you actually care a lot about what happens in between the API call and the API response. So I think that, for full stack engineers, understanding the basic mechanics of inference and the different types of inference providers that you can use in your application is actually going to become increasingly important. Just like it's important to understand databases, understand authentication like Cloak, every single aspect of the application does fall under the purview of a full stack developer, and model inference is just one more part of the full stack today.
I see. So if I can rephrase this, and you tell me if I'm wrong in stating this, it is almost like inference is important, especially when it comes to debugging things. Because like in a traditional full stack, the way that I'm wrapping my head around this, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, is if I'm building a full stack application, the data goes from the front end to the back end to the database, and there might be some business logic rules applied to it. But by the time it gets back, by the time the response is sent back to the client, if something gets out of whack, the developer needs to be able to have a way to go into the back end and figure out what happened from step 1 to step 10 in order to determine what potentially went wrong, so they can correct that for the future. Is it kind of similar to that train of thought?
Kind of. Like managing a database or managing a third-party API, managing any kind of service or microservice within your application, you're going to need to have visibility onto it, and you're going to need to have a general understanding of how it works, so that you can, first off, incorporate it into your application in the correct way. And then secondly, as you said, debug it, make sure you're able to keep it operational in production.
Okay, so Baseten helps with basically taking care of all that stuff for you.
Exactly. So Baseten is a provider of dedicated deployments. So basically, you spin up a GPU and you put the model on the GPU. We can talk a little bit about how those are different from shared inference endpoints that people might be more familiar with. But broadly, yes, you're able to take open source fine-tuned custom models. You're able to get them behind an API endpoint, and you're able to treat that as a service to integrate into your application that you still have full, control and observability in.
Yeah, I'd love to dive deeper into that if you're willing to. And I'd also, I guess, tacking on to this topic as we're discussing it, say a developer wants to get started with Baseten. They go to the website and they land there and they're reading the landing page. Like, what are the next steps from there in order to kind of get something up and running with your product?
Absolutely. So the first goal is you should have some kind of model that you want to run. So let's say, Brian, could you actually give me an example of the sort of website or web application you might be thinking about building or thinking about adding AI to?
Actually, yeah. So I'm working on a project for Clerk right now. That is, I might be in the process of pivoting to something slightly different. Let's go with one of the previous examples that I've done. I built this small demo tool called Quillmate, and the idea is I have a writing pane in the center as being a technical. I'm a developer educator, so I write a lot too. So it's kind of a tool for me, right? I have a center pane where I can write content in Markdown, and I have a chat bar on the right hand side where I can ask an LLM questions about the specific topics that I'm writing about, maybe helping it with generating outlines for the content that I'm writing, correcting grammar, stuff like that. So basically, I want this kind of, it's not really a RAG interface, the retrieval augmented generation kind of a thing, but more or less, I'm trying to build this writing assistant that's integrated directly into the tool that has the context of what I'm writing. So if I ask questions about what I'm writing, it can be prepared, it can be better equipped to answer those questions within that context.
Absolutely. So yeah, so this is just like a context-aware chat system.
Yeah.
And so behind that, you have an LLM. And I assume for this demo, you maybe have used like GPT-4o or Sonnet 3.5 or something. Yeah, absolutely. And for a demo tool, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But let's say that you were starting to scale and you had like 10,000 users on this application, and your costs are getting out of control. The GPT API downtime is really messing with you, and you decide you want to take this critical component of your application and bring it into your sphere of control. So what you would do is you would go on the Baseten website and you decide like, hey, I want to pick a large language model that I think is going to do a good job here. And running like actual evals on your use case is super important for this. So deploying models and testing them and seeing if for a set of prompts where the output you're looking for, seeing if the model does a good job on that. And let's say it does, and let's say you find a model like Llama 70B, which is the latest open source language model from Meta. It's a really, really great model for a wide range of use cases. So you take that, and on Baseten, you could actually just go through a model library and deploy it in a couple clicks, get your API endpoint right out of the box. Or if you have specific things you want to do for it, maybe you want to optimize it for throughput, optimize it for latency, you can take a configuration file, update those configurations and deploy it like that. So then you get this model as an API endpoint. And from there, it's actually super simple. The API behaves in exactly the same way as the OpenAI endpoint that you're used to. So you just change like 3 lines of code in your application, and now you're calling this other model. So going from, the one model to the other model, that's not like the huge change for you. The huge change is that now, instead of just this black box API, you have an actual server running that you can control, and you have the ability to, see your logs, see your metrics. If there's some spike of errors, you can actually go fix that, versus having a third-party service that you're completely reliant on.
Oh, that's very cool. Yeah, so one of the things we've not discussed before the show, and I don't even know how many people, viewers out there knows about me, but I actually have my own home server that I use to run like test workloads, and one of those test workloads is a Llama with I think the Llama 70B I have running on there right now, just to kind of play around with stuff to avoid having to pay for OpenAI whenever I need to just kind of like fiddle and screw around. But I kind of want to talk more about that. So it sounds like, if I wanted to, I could take that workload and run it on Baseten as opposed to utilizing my own resources to do that. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's just the same thing as going from, say, like hosting your website on a home server and exposing a port to the internet to going and using something like Vercel to host it. You're just getting a more robust production-ready infrastructure versus consumer hardware, racked up in your basement.
Yeah. Yeah. Which I definitely do not want to run production applications in my basement. So that's great to know. Now you mentioned Llama, which is an open source framework from Meta, and I know there's a lot of those out there. Especially, we've seen some of the news recently where I think it's DeepSeek or DeepSeek. I think is the one that just came out. That's kind of like taken the AI world by storm. What other models do you support that might be open source that you've maybe seen people have good success with on Baseten?
Yeah, so DeepSeek, first off, has been absolutely massive. Both DeepSeek V3, which is their sort of GPT-4o competitor, and DeepSeek R1, which is the reasoning model, more like O1. At Baseten, we were actually the first platform in the United States to run a DeepSeek model. We had V3 up and running back in December 26th of last year. And this has been huge for unlocking a large number of use cases that previously might have been impossible on open models, Llama and all these models are very capable, but definitely fall behind the frontier models on a wide range of tasks. So having frontier quality models that are completely open source that businesses can take and integrate into their workflows, and especially if you're a security conscious enterprise, run entirely in your own VPC, so that your data never leaves your own cloud. That's been a huge unlock for the types of use cases that open source models have been able to power. But in terms of what Baseten can run, what's super cool is that we can run anything. So if it's on Hugging Face, you can run it on Baseten. Any Transformers model, even stuff like, ML and data science models, all the way up through these best-in-class language models. We run embedding models, image models, Whisper audio transcription, speech synthesis. If you train a completely custom model from scratch in a brand new modality no one's ever seen before, we'll figure out how to run it for you. And what I've found a lot of, fun in terms of developing is actually using all of these different modalities together. So being able to do something like take Whisper, take an LLM, and combine them to build a cool application has been a lot of fun.
Oh, that's awesome. You mentioned something that I wasn't aware of that I want to highlight. So this infrastructure that Baseten provides, you can actually have customers on cloud providers run it within their own tenants to make sure that that data always stays within their own environment. Is that, I caught that correctly, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually something we really love to talk about is this, sort of evolution in terms of AI maturity and where you might want to run your workloads. So one step, as we talked about earlier, is moving from those shared inference endpoints to those dedicated deployments where it's just your traffic going through the GPU and there's no one else messing with your stuff. And then the second evolution from there can be going from, okay, I'm getting my GPUs from a provider like Baseten to, okay, within my VPC, within AWS, I have, say, like 100 H100 GPUs, which are, some of the biggest, best GPUs on the market today. And I want to use those for inference, but I'm going to bring in a provider like Baseten to do the orchestration, do the model performance work, get me a great developer experience, get access to expert support from embedded AI engineers. And then the other thing that we're able to do, which is really cool, is actually spill over from those resources in your VPC to resources in our VPC to handle traffic spikes. So if Kubernetes has a sort of cluster autoscaler where within a cluster of resources, you can scale workloads up and down. We've basically created a multi-cluster autoscaler that's able to scale workloads across regions, across VPCs, like scale from AWS to GCP, or scale from different providers. So like scale from your AWS account into ours. And that sort of global multi-cluster scaling, we call it like hybrid deployments, is something unique and something that's really powerful for taking advantage of the resources that you have today while also having the ability to handle traffic spikes and other sort of unexpected events.
So there's a lot to unpack there. I had a question. I wanted it to, you answered one of the questions that I was going to ask you, which was about auto scaling. So obviously, if we're running resources inside of our own cloud providers, we don't want to use things if we don't want to actually pay for stuff if it's not being used, right? So it sounds like Baseten does support some of that auto scaling stuff, and it goes even beyond a single VPC or a single cloud provider. You can scale out into either Basetens for some extra power or into different regions or clouds. But say I'm running something like a workload that I don't know. The kind of approach that comes to mind is people who do like, daily reporting or something like that, where they want to like fire up a bunch of resources, generate a bunch of reports, and then shut everything down. That's kind of a scenario that is supported or configuration for Baseten. Is that correct?
Yeah, so those sort of batch processing workloads are something that auto scaling is really good for, especially auto scaling like within our cloud. When you work with a large cloud provider like AWS and you want access to some of the highest quality GPU resources, generally they are going to ask you to make some kind of commit to those resources. So in those cases, auto scaling is less useful, although it can be useful for if you have, say, 10 GPU nodes and 5 different models. Which models are consuming how many GPUs is something you can scale around. But if you're saying, okay, I just want to pay for a burst of compute once a day for an hour, that's where something like Baseten makes sense because you're able to, scale that workload down to 0 for 23 hours of the day, spin it up to your max replicas, process everything through, and then shut it down.
That was very succinctly said. I love that. So, and good for people out there who are listening who are maybe thinking they want to use this, whether it's in their own VPC or just to utilize Baseten to, obviously save as much as they can with their own cloud bills. Now, pivoting back over to running inside of VPC, what kind of guarantees are provided by Baseten in order to make sure that, I guess let me add some context to this question and why I'm asking this. So this weekend, I was watching a video from Network Chuck, who was talking about how to run a specific open source library and I don't even know the name of this feature, but ChatGPT apparently has come out with this feature where you can have the agents where the ChatGPT can run a browser for you and actually perform tasks on your behalf. And there was an open source model. And one of the advantages that he stated in the video was if you have everything running locally, you don't have to worry about any of that information leaking out, right? So like OpenAI has some levels of privacy guarantees, but realistically, they can see all that data that's coming in and out of their environment. And that's true of any cloud provider. So people who are extremely security conscious, they want to make sure that that data, whatever's going through, is not being leaked out or able to be monitored by other companies. What kind of guarantees does Baseten have around those scenarios, specifically when that workload is running within a customer's VPC?
That's a great question. And that's another place where I know I'm talking dedicated deployments, but they're really great. And this is one of the reasons why. So if you're getting a dedicated deployment with Baseten, we're basically spinning up some resources within a workload plane. That workload plane might be one that we control or one that you control in your VPC. And all of the orchestration, the global auto scaling, the model management, all that sort of stuff happens from a centralized control plane. Basically, when you're talking about privacy of your inputs and outputs, like you don't want your stuff going anywhere centralized. You want it just hitting your workload plane directly. And that's exactly how it works. So at the DNS level, your request is routed straight to your workload plane, not through our central control plane. So there's really just no way that we would even be able to see your inputs and outputs. And that's not necessarily uniquely a Baseten feature. If you're running a workload on any GPU that you control directly, that's going to be the case. But there are some providers, even of dedicated deployments, that do send inputs and outputs through a centralized control plane, not necessarily because they want to look at it, just for like architectural reasons. But if you can get a provider that doesn't do that, then you have one of those more structural guarantees on your privacy, whether you're in our cloud or you're in yours.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, this conversation, I'm super excited about this because, as I've said before, like I have a background in infrastructure and backend development, which is typically not the type of conversations we have on this podcast. Most of it is focused on people who are hacking away at building their own individual tools. So let's bring it back to that, right?
Absolutely.
So what are some of the coolest, and I asked this question with the understanding of there might be some respect for privacy here. So you don't have to answer this, please. But what are some of the coolest like applications and services you've seen be successful in using Baseten with products that might be out in the wild?
Well, fortunately, I have written a handful of case studies around our customers that I get to talk about. We have just incredible customers building amazing things. One that's really cool that's been getting a ton of press recently is a company called Bland that does AI phone calling. And what's cool about their use case, where they're trying to replace that terrible customer service experience of navigating a phone tree and then waiting 20 minutes for someone to pick up the phone, is they're trying to make very natural conversations. And that is extremely latency sensitive. So you have multiple different models that you have to run and orchestrate those together and get the call through end to end with a turnaround SLA measured in the hundreds of milliseconds, like 300, 400 milliseconds for some of these different turnarounds. So they have a really cool product and a really interesting, multi-model latency sensitive use case. And that's one of my favorite things that I've seen built with us. But we've also, supported a bunch of other companies. There's this company that I talked to a few months ago called Toby. Toby has a really interesting product where basically the idea is people want to work together, but don't necessarily speak the same language. Like you might want to work with a developer in another country who doesn't speak English, and you want to still be able to get on a video call and talk over some code, do a code review, do a PRD kickoff, whatever you want to do. And so what Toby does is it sits on top of your video call and it translates bidirectionally. So maybe I'm speaking in Spanish, but it's going to sort of dub over that in real time or close to real time, a couple hundred milliseconds. And so you're just going to hear English. And as you're speaking in English to me, I might hear Spanish dubbed over that. There's also going to be sort of a transcript on both sides just to kind of show how the chat is going. So just in case there's something wrong with the dubbing, I can also read it. So it's kind of like dubs and subtitles real time onto your video call. And so we helped them with like the product hunt launch. They had some homebrewed infrastructure on AWS that we whipped out and replaced with our stuff. And so, yeah, it's just really cool to see how generative models are used not just for chat, not just for talking to the model directly, but how they can also help us talk to each other.
Cool. Thank you for sharing it. Every time I hear these stories about what AI is unlocking for products and companies, it like fascinates me. And the whole like real-time transcription thing that's actually being used in the wild. I mean, I've heard about these on podcasts for years, people talking about this being like an eventual future. And it's kind of mind-blowing to know that it's here, with the power of AI. So what are some cool and interesting things that maybe Baseten has around the corner for customers? Anything on the roadmap you could share?
Yeah, there's a few things that we've been working on recently. One is something called multi-node inference. So models are getting bigger and more powerful. You talked about DeepSeek earlier. DeepSeek is a really large model. It's 671 billion parameters. And a simple rule of thumb for running inference is that for every billion parameters, if you're running in FP8 precision, which is 8-bit floating point numbers, you're going to need a gigabyte of VRAM or GPU RAM to hold that model. So if you're running, for example, your Llama 70B model on a home server, if you have, say, 4090 GPUs, you might need 4 of those to be able to hold the whole model. Or if you're running it on, say, like a Apple's Mac Studio that might come with 128 gigabytes of unified memory, great, that's going to be enough to hold that 70 gigabyte model, or that 70 billion parameter model. But if you are running DeepSeek, that's 671 billion parameters. So that needs 671 gigabytes just to load the model weights. And then you need KV cache and activations on top of that. So really, you're going to want about double that much GPU VRAM capacity. If you take the H100, which is kind of the gold standard for inference today, it's a widely available, this current generation GPU by NVIDIA built for data centers. Each one of those has 80 gigabytes of VRAM on it. And they come in nodes of up to 8. So if you take a whole node of 8, you've got 640 gigabytes of VRAM. Do you see the problem here? It's 640 gigabytes of VRAM, but you need 671 just to load the model, much less to run it. So what you can do is you can actually take 2 nodes, attach them together through a high bandwidth interconnect called InfiniBand, or similar like AWS GCP, they have their own versions. And then you're able to split the model across 2 nodes and run it like that. This is actually really complicated from both a infrastructure provisioning perspective and from a model performance perspective, doing your optimizations with a sort of awareness of the topology of the hardware that you're running, making sure that you're not going to get bottlenecked off that interconnect is a really fun challenge. We just published about that recently. We're looking into a bunch of other really cool things on the infrastructure side. There's new research around things like new forms of speculative decoding, disaggregated serving, which lets you use the right hardware for the initial pre-fill step, the time to first token step, and then different hardware for the next token generation step, because those two are bottlenecked on different things. So there's a lot of really cool things coming up on the infrastructure and performance side that I'm really excited about, because every time our engineering teams make a cool breakthrough, I get to go learn all about it and write a blog post. And that's one of my favorite parts of my job.
Yeah, that's it's a really fun. My role is very similar. It's also great to have those engineering resources at hand, so you can ask questions to clarify things, and then deduce it down into something that others understand.
Absolutely. I'm constantly, ambushing engineers as they're trying to, walk to the kitchen and get a snack. And I'm like, hey, just answer my 16 questions about this, and then I'll let you go.
Right, exactly. Awesome. So I I always open my podcast with an icebreaker, but I always end them with the same question, which I'm going to ask you
Ooh.
now. So, what advice do you have for builders? Let's hyper focus in on LLM. Like, say we
Yeah.
have a builder, somebody someone who's thinking about creating their own product. They know they want to use AI around it. What advice would you have for them? To kind of like set them in the right direction.
Well, a couple things. The first thing is that when you're building a brand new product, what I would always recommend is just like take the biggest, best, most capable model first and build around that because models are getting better all the time. So if a model today has the capabilities you need, then build around it. And in 6 or 12 months, the price of running that quality of model is going to drop substantially and everything's going to get better. And then if, the biggest, best model is not capable of doing the things you need it to today after all your testing and prompt engineering and stuff, well, then, maybe you need to mess with the product a little bit or wait for a better model or maybe figure out some way to do something that's a mix of, traditional business logic and AI calls to be able to create those capabilities that you're trying to build for. But once you have your product working, once you have a model in place that's capable of generating the types of output that you want, I think it's really important to build custom evals. It's really important to understand the types of output you expect from your model and be able to systematically test new models as they come out to see if they work better for your product. New models are measured on a set of benchmarks that are kind of industry standard. And there is some concern around saturation of these benchmarks or the idea that the models are kind of trained for the test and they're trying to, perform extremely well on these benchmarks, but may or may not perform well in reality. And a lot of the sort of reality-based analysis is really just vibes. It's like, hey, did I talk to this model and say, some things? Was it interesting? Was it not? Did it feel smart? All of the best sort of AI native companies are really deeply invested in evals and have a really strong understanding of the exact capabilities that they need from their models, which allows them to evaluate new models as they come out. It allows them to test open source and fine-tuned models to see if they can take a process they're running now and run it on a smaller, cheaper, faster model. So having just really quality evaluation framework and a clear understanding of what you are trying to build is going to be massive for being able to select the actual right model for your use case instead of just being stuck with like vibe-based analysis of whatever the top 2 or 3 models are at any given time.
Yeah, I'm gonna rewatch this and take some notes on that, especially because there's some things I want to build. That was great advice. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and
F-
my DMs are always open on Twitter, LinkedIn. I've got my email up, so just hit me up if you have any questions. That goes to you, Brian, and to anyone watching.
yeah, and with that, I mean, that was my next question. Where can people find you? Why don't you? I know we're going to drop some links in the show notes for anyone afterwards who wants just to quickly access them. But what's your handle on Twitter, and what's the best place to reach out to you at?
So I've invested heavily on SEO on my own name. So if you just search Philip Keily, you'll find me just about anywhere. But I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn primarily. I'm also publishing constantly on the Baseten blog, so definitely take a look at that. And yeah, those are the best places to find me. You can also just always send me an email. It's philip.kiley@baseten.co.
Great, thank you. Philip, thanks once again for joining me today, just to hash this out. It's super interesting. There's a lot of homework I got to go do to like fill in some of the gaps here, just about things that I don't personally understand. But also thanks to everyone out there who joined us for the live recording of this. If you have any questions, reach out to Philip. If you're interested in connecting with some other builders, we also have a Discord server. Fullstack.chat is where you would go to find access to the Discord as well as the back catalog of Full Stack Chat episodes. And if you want to, on the topic of backlogs, you can find Full Stack Chat everywhere inside of your favorite podcatcher. We're also on YouTube, as well as live streaming on X and LinkedIn. And with that, I will see everyone in the next one. Bye-bye.